Mac, what are your thoughts on Notswap? My thoughts on Notswap is that for the past 24 hours, I have been hearing way too much about Notswap. This is the only thing I see on Twitter. There's Notswap this, Notswap that. Blah, 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 blah. I'm sick of hearing about it. So I'll give you my thoughts, and then I'm never going to speak about it ever again. For those who are unfamiliar, by the way, Notswap is like a intrinsic game-wide mechanic, I guess is the way you could phrase it, for Trials of Osiris, where, and I could be getting the specifics of it a little bit wrong, but the general idea is that if you make a swap, a significant swap to your loadout, i.e. you change your exotic armor piece, or you change certain weapons, like if you change a primary ammo weapon to a special ammo weapon in that same slot or something like that, then you lose all of your ability energy and all of your super energy. And there have been talks recently about Bungie adding that to PvE. Now, to what degree is currently unknown. Like, will it just be in contest raids? Will it just be in Rite of the Nine, the new dungeon activity coming up? Will it just be, like, maybe it won't happen in strikes? I don't really know. But the idea of it, I'd imagine, is to combat loadout swapping mid-encounter, right? So, like, you're in the middle of the encounter, you do this, you have a different loadout set up, you swap to it. And typically the reason you would do that is because it's mainly for, like, raid boss encounters, to be honest. So, like, you have one set of armor that has, like, maybe ability regeneration mods on your gear when you're not in DPS phase. And then you swap to, like, surges when you go into the DPS phase or something like that. Like, that's typically the setup that people have. Or a lot of things that people will do is they'll have, like, a loadout where, say, for example, they're on, like, say they're on Celestial or they're on Golden Gun. And when they go into DPS phase, they'll hit this. So they pop their Nighthawk during DPS phase. And then when they go back to the intermission phase, they go back to their, like, neutral game exotic. And so I think the idea that Bungie is trying to push is, like, hey, you should, generally speaking, have, like, the same loadout throughout a given individual encounter. And it's actually a very complex issue. It's more complex than you'd think. Because I think the knee-jerk reaction that a lot of players will have is, F no, that is stupid. Why are you going to punish me for changing weapons? That's dumb. And I agree. I do think it is dumb to punish a player for, like, changing a piece of their loadout mid-encounter. But the reason it's something that you do have to consider is because, and this is not in any capacity permission for anyone to blame talented players or higher end players for ruining the game because they are good at the game and they maximize efficiency and they maximize their builds and they maximize their ability to complete things, okay? So if you're in the comment section or you're running around ripping on good players, not it. Okay? Don't be that person. It's a video game. Calm down. Now that we've simmered. The reason that this is a potential problem is because, specifically when you look towards competitive activities and competitive Destiny environments, so things like World's First raid races, contest mode dungeons, contest mode raids, the things that are supposed to be the pinnacle of Destiny 2. Whenever you have something in the game that can increase player power, Bungie has to take that into consideration when they're designing encounters. They have to take that into consideration when it comes to how many ads are we going to throw at them? How much damage are the ads going to do? How much HP is the boss going to have? How long should the DPS phase be? How many DPS phases do they get? Like, these are a lot of things that they have to consider when they're designing things like contest mode dungeons. Because if you have, like, say, for example, like Nezarec, right? In Root of Nightmares. It's not the most pinnacle experience when you can two-phase Nezarec in contest mode on day 1 with a bunch of Thunderlords. Like, you do that and you're like, eh. Okay. Like, when Bungie designs these activities, and similarly when they design something like The Rite of the Nine, where we're getting like a contest mode gauntlet of old dungeons, they're designed in a way of like, okay, this is where you can prove yourself as like an incredible player. This is where you challenge yourself. This is where like we throw everything that we have at you and you need to figure out how to overcome the challenge. And you have to be incredible at ad clear. You have to be incredible at DPS. You have to be incredible at survivability. You have to be incredible at the mechanics. You have to be like, you have to tick all the boxes, right? And the only way Bungie can force players to do that is by creating genuinely challenging experiences. And the way that they create genuinely challenging experiences is by pushing us to our limits when it comes to damage and all that type of stuff, right? And the only way that they can do that is by designing encounters around the assumption that players at that level are going to be using the most powerful things available to them in the game. Because if they don't design it with those things in mind, then everyone's going to steamroll these challenging encounters, right? For example, right? I don't know if people know this or don't know this, but Bungie, for the past however many years, has had to design raid bosses under the assumption that you will have a Well of Radiance while you're DPSing it. They have had to design raid bosses around the idea that the entire team is invincible and has a 30% weapon DPS bonus. It's lower now, but for the longest time it was either 25% or 30%. They have to, they had to design every single boss with that idea in mind. Because if they didn't, and then people pulled up with Well of Radiance, then they would have smashed everything. And the challenging, difficult activities would be boring. So in a similar vein, Bungie has to design the most difficult content in the game under the assumption that players are going to be loadout swapping in that content. Because if they don't design it around the idea of loadout swapping, then people who do walk in and loadout swap will absolutely beat the bricks off of it. So when Bungie looks at something like hot swapping or not swapping, the reason they're doing it is because they're looking at it through a lens of like, we want to even the playing field. And we want to even the playing field so that people who don't do loadout swaps and people who do normally do loadout swaps are kind of in a similar boat. We want to eliminate the number of like, I'm going to call them pseudo-cheese strategies. Because loadout swapping is not cheesing. But it is definitely like, loadouts were not created with the intention of allowing players to shuffle through 4 different loadouts to get optimal DPS in every single facet and phase of a particular DPS phase. Like, if you look at if you look at the world record speedrun for the Sundered Doctrine dungeon, you'll see that the players that have the record for that, they swap their loadout in DPS phase alone like 3 or 4 different times. Because that's the most optimal way to kill the boss. So they also want to do this because it makes designing bosses and designing encounters and balancing bosses and balancing encounters way easier for them. Which is good. Like, if I'm Bungie, I don't want to design every single raid boss and every single raid encounter with like, okay, now I have to account for the fact that they always have a Well of Radiance. And I have to account for the fact that they're always going to be able to crit it because they always have Divinity on it. And I have to account for the fact that they're going to be loadout swapping. It's like, that's a pain. And it limits encounter creativity and encounter diversity. That being said, I don't love how they're currently looking at... I don't love the proposed solution of not swapping. And the reason I don't like the proposed solution of not swapping is because not only, like, yes, you're cleaning up that issue of players loadout swapping to get 5%, 10% benefits, which are significant in the hardest difficulties of content. Yes, you are clearing that up, which I think is, like, I don't think it's inherently a bad thing for Bungie to be like, hey, we think it's kind of goofy that if you want to, like, be the best of the best and compete at the top level, that you need to swap between 4 different loadouts in one DPS phase. Like, I don't think that's such a bad thing. That being said, I think the way they're trying to go about solving it, their proposed solution, does a lot more harm than good. Because, yes, if you implement something like Notswap, you do eradicate, like, the era of, like, loadout swap, mid-encounter, mid-DPS phase, all that. But you also then punish the player who's just, like, switching to their shoot-to-loot scout rifle to plink a couple bricks before DPS phase because it's not safe to run out and get them. And, or you're punishing the player who's like, okay, I'm doing an encounter. The first part of the encounter encourages me to be, like, very long range, and the second part of the encounter encourages me to be a lot more close range. So halfway through the encounter, I'm going to swap my SMG to a scout rifle. And it's like, I think that's something that you should not be punished for. I don't think you should have to, like, in the middle of an encounter, go through the calculation in your head of, like, okay, I want to switch my SMG to a scout rifle. Is this worth losing all of my abilities in my super? Yeah. It's also trying to solve the problem of, like, for example, I think it's also trying to solve the problem of, okay, I have Anarchy on right now, and I'm trying to go into DPS phase for Zoetic Lockset, but, oh, the game just didn't drop me any heavy ammo, so I don't have any Anarchy ammo. So I want to, okay, so because the game didn't give me any heavy ammo, I'm going to swap to Wither Horde instead, but, oh, because I swapped Wither Horde, now my super's gone, and it's like, that's not... And you might say, okay, we'll just use Aeons and Cenotaph, and it's like, I really want to get away from the contest mode era of, like, you are required to use Aeons and Cenotaph because you don't know if you're going to get ammo or not. There's a lot of, like, not swapping and loadout swapping is a very, like, complex problem. Because a big reason that it exists in a lot of situations is because of other problems in the game. Like, ammo econ plays into loadout swapping / not swapping. Certain designs of exotic armor pieces plays, like, for example, right, like Couriers of the Falling Star. There's no reason to have that equipped unless you are currently using Thunder Crash. And so it's like, if we take that example specifically, I don't want Bungie to look at that situation and be like, oh, players have no reason to have Couriers of the Falling Star on unless they're using Thunder Crash in that very moment. I don't want them to look at that and be like, okay, let's punish them for swapping off of it. I want them to look at it and say, okay, well, let's tweak it a little bit so that we give them reasons to keep it equipped outside of DPS phases. Like, either let's make that exotic perk where it benefits Thunder Crash. Let's either make it so that you have to ramp that up over time, similar to like Star Eater Scales, where maybe you have to get like 10 kills to get the maximum DPS buff while you have the exotic equipped. And if you unequip it, then you lose your stacks. Or you give it like an extra benefit. So it's like, hey, now it increases the damage of your T-Crash and it does XYZ or whatever, right? Now, I mean, it's a super complex problem. Now, you could look at the angle of like, okay, well, what if Bungie only puts Notswap on specific activities, right? Again, I still feel like I can't think of a way to implement Notswap that also does collateral damage for people that are just swapping things in encounters, not because they're trying to take advantage of like swapping between 4 different loadouts, but because they're just like, oh, like I want to throw in a scout rifle for this part of the encounter. And again, like I don't think that's something you should be punished for. I think yeah. I think it is a little goofy to like, you can make the argument that it's skill expression and it should stay in the game. I think you can go either direction on that. But I'm just looking at it through the lens of like, okay, here's the best way I can wrap it up in a bow, I think, honestly. If we implement Notswap to solve the problem of loadout swapping, how many new problems do we create? Right? So, like, and what I mean by that is, if it's like, if our solution to solving, if our solution to really over-the-top loadout swapping creates a new problem that punishes players for doing simple swaps that, in my opinion, are very reasonable, then, like, to me, that's not a good solution. And that negatively affects way more people than the current issue of loadout swapping does. Do you guys in the chat have any hard thoughts? Rusty Icepick, thanks so much for converting your Prime sub to a tier 1 sub, by the way. All the activities where Notswap would exist require swapping, generally because of ammo. I agree. Yeah. Nobody has a problem with locked loadouts for GMs, so why would Notswap be any different? Because they're inherently different things. Like, so, okay, so, like, are you making the argument? Because not swapping and locked loadouts are different things. So, let me ask you this. If you're in a raid, and if you're in a raid, do you think that your loadout should become locked when you start an encounter? It's like, you can change things during an intermission, you can change things during a jump-in puzzle, you can change things before you rally to the flag, but once the encounter starts, once you enter the darkness zone for that encounter, your loadout locks. Do you think that would be a good thing? Because to be completely honest, I don't. I don't think that would be a good thing. I think the reason Grandmaster Nightfalls work with locked loadouts is, like, they are a different brand of activity than things like dungeons and raids. The entire idea of GMs is is we get to pick what we're doing for this GM, and then we go in, and then we either beat it, or it's back to square one, loadouts included, right? Raids heavily encourage you to iterate and experiment after each wipe. Furthermore, a Grandmaster Nightfall is exponentially shorter than a raid. I also, like, I don't get... I think a big thing you have to consider as well is how truly big is loadout? Like, how truly big of a problem is loadout swapping? I think in PvP, in Trials of Osiris, it is absolutely a very big problem. It makes the game so much harder to balance. When someone can, for example... like, I know it's not really good these days, but for those who played back in Forsaken, do you guys remember how OP Gwizinvest was? Spectral Blades Gwizinvest? Or, what was the name of the helmet that gave you infinite Fist of Havoc? Was that, oh my god, why can't I remember it? Was it Eternal Warrior? Or was it Skullfort? I think it was Skullfort, maybe. Right? It might have been Skullfort. Or was it Eternal? I think it was Eternal, maybe. Yeah, Improved Fist of Havoc. Eternal Warrior. So, like, in PvP, it absolutely makes sense. Because it's so much harder to balance PvP if you're balancing it under the idea of, like, oh, players can just throw this helmet on right before they pop their super, and then when they're done with their super, they can swap to Peregrines. Or Dune Marchers. Or whatever, right? So I think it makes sense in PvP, because that's like, okay, if you want to run a build where the idea is, if you get your Fist of Havoc, then you are the scariest thing on the planet. You're more than welcome to invest in that. But, like, that's what you're investing into. You don't get to have... You don't get to have your cake and eat it, too. Right? Your trade-off for being disgustingly broken in your super is that your neutral game doesn't benefit as much. So in PvP, it makes a whole lot of sense. I'm not entirely convinced that it makes a whole lot of sense in PvE. I do think, like I said, in certain areas, it does make sense. Because, like, if you're Bungie and you're balancing a day one experience, you're balancing a contest raid, you're balancing a contest dungeon, you definitely don't want to have to balance everything under the assumption that everyone's going to be loadout swapping. Because then if you don't loadout swap, then you're at a significant disadvantage for what the activity's balanced for. And if vice versa happens, if Bungie doesn't balance it around loadout swaps, then anyone with loadout swaps cooks it. What's the harm in trying it out? I mean, technically, there's not harm in trying it out. Technically, you can make that argument for anything, though. Just because you're allowed to try things and then undo them doesn't mean that I think that you should automatically try whatever you want. I think Destiny as a game has always been something that encourages you to, like, use whatever is available to you. You make the most of your arsenal. Adapt. Be smart. Be crafty. In the moment. It's always been a game that encourages you to, like, use build crafting and loadout options to counter and defeat the challenge that you're up against, right? And at least in PvE. And when you look at something that punishes players for adapting to a situation on the fly, you kind of venture. You're starting to walk the road of, hey, we discourage you from being versatile. We discourage you from adapting. You have to pick one thing and lock it in. And I guess to tie a bow on it, like my ultimate like TLDR is I would love for them to find a way to fix the problem of, like, I'm mid DPS phase, boom, 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 boom. I do 6 swaps mid DPS phase. I absolutely would love them to fix that problem, because I think that's a bit extreme. That's a bit much. And I think it's a burden for Bungie to balance things around that. Like, that's probably pretty annoying. But if the solution... I don't think a solution that nukes any swap is a good solution. To me, that's a solution that's creating more problems than it's solving. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I'm just... What? Just yapping.